Okay, so welcome back everybody to our policy panel on the future of global value chains. As you all know, one of the distinctive features of globalization in recent decades has been the emergence of these global value chains and the fragmentation of production across national borders. And as trade economists, we typically point to three sets of forces that have driven that emergence of GVCs, namely multilateral regional trade policy integration, technological innovations such as the computer, the satellite phone, and the internet that have reduced the cost of international communication. And then, of course, thirdly, geopolitical and institutional changes, such as domestic reform in China, the fall of the Iron Curtain, and the emergence of India into global markets. The recent resurgence of protection in the United States and elsewhere, recent supply chain disruptions in the aftermath of the COVID-19 pandemic and the Russia-Ukraine war, and of course, rising geopolitical tensions between China and the United States, as you all know, have led to a renewed debate about the resiliency of supply chains and the future of global value chains. For example, to what extent are we going to see a deglobalization of the world economy in coming decades, or will it more take the form of a snowballization, a slowing down of global integration? Will we start to see a diversification of sourcing strategies, of increased onshoring, reshoring, or in the words of Janet Yellen, friendshoring? To what extent are the decisions of firms efficient? To what extent are the potential room for policy interventions? What will be the impact of the industrial policies that a number of countries now appearing to be pursuing with more attention? And what will be the implications of the Inflation Reduction Act here in the United States and the recent export controls that the United States has introduced relating to the semiconductors industry? So we have an absolutely stellar, distinguished panel to address these and many other related issues, including Renee Bowen, the director of the Center for Commerce and Diplomacy at the UCSD School of Global Policy and Strategy, Chad Bowen, the Reginald Jones Senior Fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics, and Ralph Ossa, the Kuhn Foundation Professor of Economics at the University of Zurich and Chief Economist of the World Trade Organization. As you know, as the NBER, we're a non-partisan institution that doesn't make policy recommendations, but there's sort of plenty of room for us to talk about the economics underlying these trends and the potential effects of different policies that are adopted around the world. Each of our panelists is going to aim to talk for around 15 minutes before we then open things up for Q&A and general discussion. And we're going to proceed in alphabetical order by last name, starting with Renee, before turning to Chad, before turning to Ralph. So I'm sure, like me, you're all really excited to hear what our panelists have to say on these issues. And so handing the floor over now to you, Renee.
Thanks, Steve, for that really warm welcome, and really excited to be here. I'm going to caveat this with, I'm a micro theorist, so I'm probably the least qualified to be on this panel. But what I'm going to do is talk a lot about something I know a little about and talk a little about something I know a lot about. So this is semiconductor supply chains, a political economy perspective. What's great is once you've had one talk about supply chains, you're a supply chain expert. So here we go. Okay, so it is a political economy perspective. So I want to talk first a little bit about the economics. So we've all heard about supply chains. We've all heard about semiconductor supply chains. So I'm going to think about this as if I'm teaching MBAs, where you probably know loads more than I do, but I'm going to give you just enough of a flavor to appreciate the political economy. So the first thing is looking at the top 5 semiconductor producing countries. And then we're going to unpack what we mean by semiconductor producing countries. So here we see the United States is the largest semiconductor producing country by far, 46% market share. And you're probably scratching your heads and you're saying, well, what about TSMC and Taiwan? Isn't that what all the fuss is about? Here you're seeing that Taiwan only has 8% of the market share. China has 7% of the market share. So really, what is all the fuss about? So here's what all the fuss is about. We have to break down semiconductor production into its little bits. And there are lots and lots and lots of little bits. It is a hugely complicated thing to produce. And one thing that I'd like to impress upon this group is there's so much research to be done just purely based on how complicated it is to produce semiconductors. So this is a teeny tiny graphic that doesn't actually capture everything, but it does capture some big points that are important for the political economy. So number one is design. So design takes almost no infrastructure. This is completely IP, and there are lots of companies that all they do is produce IP. Qualcomm is one example. So you see here from this diagram that design software goes into this, intellectual property goes into this. So when we're talking about the United States as a huge semiconductor manufacturing company, a lot of it is just in design. When we talk about education for semiconductor manufacturing in the United States, a lot of this is design. When we talk about engineers in the United States that are doing semiconductor research, a lot of it is design, computer science, which is not about electrical engineering, which is something I'll come back to in a bit. So the second part is fabrication, right? So actually producing these things. In the United States, as you well know, we don't actually produce a whole lot of these things. This is where Taiwan comes in, and to some extent, China. And I'll get to that in just a second. But here's where the materials come in, the chemicals come in. So we talk about these rare earth minerals. This is where it all comes in. And speaking of rare earth minerals, where do a lot of rare earth minerals come from? They come from Africa, right? So when we're talking about this global semiconductor supply chain, we're pulling in almost every single continent, and we're pulling in tons of countries. What about assembly and testing? Assembly and testing, again, this is another part of the production process that can happen somewhere else. It can happen in China, it can happen in other developing countries. And that's something that can be moved around, and it's a little bit less low tech. Okay, so now I want to talk about fabless semiconductor companies. What do I mean by fabless semiconductor companies? So let me just back up 1 second. At some point in time in the 1980s and earlier, all of this was done in-house by companies such as Intel. And at some point, this fellow came along. His name is Morris Chang. He's originally from China, but then moved to Taiwan. And in 1949, he was an undergrad at Harvard. And that's when he moved to the United States. From there, he went on to MIT, really good school. I happen to know that for a fact. And that was in 1952. He did a master's degree. He entered a PhD program. And for all you PhD students who might be out there, apparently he failed his qualifying exams twice. So from there, he went on to quite a good career in not in academia, and eventually he ended up at Texas Instruments in 1958 and spent a very long time at Texas Instruments, climbed the corporate ladder, and eventually said he'd had enough, wanted to return to Taiwan. On returning to Taiwan, the Taiwanese government tapped him to be part of ITRI. So ITRI is the Taiwanese, might be called the Taiwanese NSF, if you would. So this is where they want to do all their research and develop their domestic technology industries. So this is 1987. Now, Morris Chang looks at what's going on in Taiwan. And at the time, Taiwan was producing small manufacturers, but they were sort of just the widget guys, all right? So someone else was designing these manufacturers. They were putting it together, exporting it. But they were doing a really good job. And Morris Chang said, well, why don't we do this for semiconductor manufacturing? The Taiwanese wanted to produce semiconductors, but there was no way that they could get into the semiconductor industry because of the high barriers to entry. So indeed, the Taiwanese government put in lots of funding into starting TSMC. There was also private funding, some of it from the United States, to start TSMC. And before we know it, TSMC is growing leaps and bounds as a foundry company. So this is not a semiconductor manufacturing company. They simply carved out the most expensive part of the production process and decided to do just that. And many of these integrated companies decided to follow suit and simply use the foundry process from TSMC. Meanwhile, doing all their design in-house. So as we have here, TSMC created the semiconductor dedicated IC foundry business model. It was an entirely different business model. It came with a lot of support from the Taiwanese government, and to this day gets quite some support from the Taiwanese government, much of it in kind. So what about today? Top 5 foundry companies today. So we can see number 1, TSMC, 55% market share. Number 2, Samsung, that's in South Korea, 17% market share. USMC is Taiwanese, 16%. Global Foundries in the United States, 7%. SMIC in China is 4%. So if we're looking at foundries, the United States has 7% market share of foundries in 2021. That's minuscule. So for the United States to actually become a major semiconductor producing country, you see we've got a long way to go in terms of actual foundries. So what about fabless semiconductor companies? So fabless simply means they've taken all of the manufacturing out of their production process. All they're doing is producing the IP, the technology. And one of the biggest manufacturers, or at least the biggest manufacturer here, is Qualcomm in the United States. So what are the other large manufacturers? Broadcom, also in the United States. NVIDIA in the United States. MediaTek is from Taiwan. AMD is in the United States. So now you understand where that large market share from the United States comes from in semiconductor manufacturing. This is all fabless. This has nothing to do with manufacturing. So what is it that the US government would like to do? The US government would like to, as far as I understand, bring semiconductor manufacturing back into the United States. But you see that we've got a long way to go. And number 1 is understanding this process. Okay, so we've already talked about how complicated the production process itself is. The next question we have to ask is, where's the United States actually missing parts of this production process? So I should warn you that as a theorist, I don't do data, I do pictures. So you're going to see lots of pictures pulled from lots of places. And this one is pulled from Supporting the Future of US-Based Semiconductor Manufacturing from SUNY. And that's going to be important coming up. SUNY, State University of New York. And this was a 2022 report that they had put together. So the thing they wanted to highlight in this report is that there's a lot to do to bridge the gap. In the United States, doing great on research and development. In some parts of the United States, doing really well on commercialization, the end product. But what we're missing in the middle, number 1, is strong workforce. So all this time that TSMC and all these other countries are building up manufacturing capabilities for semiconductors, we were reducing manufacturing capabilities, but at the same time reducing the workforce capable of working in these semiconductor manufacturing facilities. And the joke I like to tell is, if you talk to anyone in semiconductor manufacturing, the one thing they say that they're missing: plumbers. So workforce development. This has become a really important part of the semiconductor picture. So everyone knows about the CHIPS and Science Act of 2022. Maybe you don't know that the overall number is actually $278 billion. A lot of people have focused on the $39 billion. That was the first tranche that's being funded. And that's being funded largely through the Commerce Department. So what you can see is that a lot of the rest of the $278 billion is really for STEM and R&D. That's the big chunk in the middle. A lot of it also goes into defense, but for now we're going to drill down on this $39 million. A good chunk of that also is for workforce development. So this comes from the Semiconductor Industry Association of the United States, and it breaks down a little bit how much is available from what pools of resources for workforce development. So there's direct workforce funding, but that's about $200 million over 5 years. There's indirect workforce funding. This is $13 billion in R&D funding, support, STEM education, workforce and skills training, et cetera, et cetera. And you can see in that top right quadrant, there's something called NSTC. So as part of the CHIPS Act, they authorized the creation of a National Science Technology Council. And this is intended to be a huge national science and technology council that helps to inform the manufacturing capacity or capabilities of the semiconductor industry. And then there are other things that are a little bit smaller pools. So a call goes out October 22, 2022, and now we're getting a little bit to the political economy. A call goes out from the Commerce Department, request for information about these semiconductor institutes, these NSTCs, et cetera. And I've pulled here 4 of these proposals that were done in response. Bearing in mind, October 2022, this call goes out. Now, let me just focus on some dates here. February 2022 was one of the earlier proposals, comes actually before October 2022, accelerating semiconductor research in the United States. So that was a group called ASIC, and ASIC consisted of a lot of Silicon Valley type organizations, academics, companies, et cetera, right? The second one is called SEMI. SEMI involves the Arizona crew. And I'm being very flip here, apologies. And then there's the New California Coalition. They put together something in October 2022. And then there's the SUNY Coalition, and they put something together in September 2021. See how far ahead these guys are. This request comes out in October 2022. As far as I know, they've had over 300 responses. But if you are responding, or if you begin your response in October 2022, well, you're already way behind the ball. So just to kind of wrap up, again, this is the political economy part of it. So in December 2022, TSMC announced that in addition to Arizona's first fab, so TSMC already invested in one fab, they have started construction on a second fab in Arizona. Why Arizona? I wonder why. Is this a political economy audience here? Yes. And that is scheduled to begin production in 2026. At the same time, Applied Materials said it plans to spend about $4 billion on a research center in the heart of Silicon Valley. Remember, I was talking about those NSTCs. So these are the large R&D facilities that the CHIPS Act is supposed to fund. So Applied Materials is hoping that they can get a piece of that pie by investing in Silicon Valley, this $4 billion. So what do they intend to do? They intend to host about $25 billion of research work over its first decade, pulling together staff from research universities, chip makers such as Intel, TSMC, and Samsung. Interesting. So one of the things I wanted to leave you with is there's been a lot of misperception as well about the geopolitics of what's going on in the semiconductor industry. Assertions that in the United States, there's actually competition between the United States and, say, Taiwan for semiconductor production. But as we can see, TSMC, the main Taiwanese company, is actually coordinating quite a bit with US companies. Now, this makes a lot of sense. If you've heard this term before, the Silicon Shield, the Silicon Shield effectively says, because semiconductor production is so important to most countries, the fact that the Chinese government is sort of an ever-present threat for Taiwan, the silicon production in Taiwan makes them feel protected. Should anyone ever attack Taiwan, then the semiconductor production, I've heard it called the, catastrophic event. I think they're more, dramatic terms, but effectively, almost all production in the world would come to a halt. So this is a silicon shield that Taiwan is depending on. And since Taiwan is depending on this silicon shield, of course, it needs to cooperate with its allies. So the founder of TSMC says TSMC, Asia's most valuable listed companies, refer to in Taiwan as a sacred mountain protecting the country because of its economic importance. Now, going back to globalization, as Stephen pointed out, TSMC's founder says globalization is taking a backseat to priorities such as national security and technological leadership. And that's the direction I think we're heading. And without explicitly looking at national security in our models, in our research, I think we're going to be missing a lot of the boat in terms of how we understand trade. Now, the last thing I'll end with here is that there's a little bit more than talk on this cooperation. So US-Taiwan just announced an initiative on 21st century trade, and that was signed June 1, 2023. And what's the intention? To strengthen and deepen the economic and trade relationship between the United States and Taiwan. So I'll leave with that. Hopefully that's just a flavor of things that we can get the conversation started. Thanks.
Thank you. Okay, so Renee is amazing, and if I aspire to be a micro theorist. So you're stuck next with a podcast host. So if it gets bad to worse, anyway. So I'm going to talk also about the future of global value chains, but through the lens of industrial policy. And in particular, what I'm going to do here is I'm going to stick electric vehicles in a Caliendo and Pero model. Okay, so if you thought the last presentation that we gave was strange, just wait. No, I'm kidding. There'll be no quantitative models here. But this is about the Inflation Reduction Act and industrial policy. So I may need to click on the. There we go. Okay. What are we trying to do here, right? So what's the underlying externality that we're trying to get at? And obviously it's climate change, right? And so the big concern is that the United States, in terms of our Paris commitments, you have to remember President Trump pulled the United States out of the Paris Agreement. The Biden administration comes in and is committed to tackling climate change again. So where do our emissions come from? Well, about 40% or so comes from transportation. It's a big chunk of what we throw out into the atmosphere. And of that, nearly 60% is personal vehicles, things that you or I drive around. So then another 25% is commercial, trucks, vans, things like that. And the concern was that for the things that we can control, people, right? We just weren't switching to electric vehicles quickly enough. So by the end of 2021, it was less than 5% of new vehicles entering the market each year coming onto the roads were electric. And we're trailing China, which was already 16% at that point in time, Europe, 18%, and even Korea, right? So there's just a lot for us in the United States to do. It's not, so there's this guy out there named Elon Musk. He doesn't get out all that much. You might not have heard of him. They have a company called Tesla. So you might think, well, there's this amazing Tesla brand out there. And so maybe what the United States is doing is just exporting these amazing Teslas to the world. And that would explain why we're not taking them up here, right? Prices go up and that could explain it. No, right? So this is export data, and this is 12-month, I think it's 12-month trailing sums I have put together here. In value terms, that's the top, and in volume terms, so number of vehicles on the bottom here. And you can see that in value terms, it's the Europeans, right? They produce a lot of fancy, high-end, expensive electric vehicles. But in volume terms, this is now China, right? But the United States is really lagging in exports as well. So that's not the story either. So to kind of summarize where we are on electric vehicles heading into, say the Biden administration, we're not taking them up enough. And part of that is, we live in a giant country here in the United States. Americans like to drive big vehicles. They like to drive them long distances. And so there's this range anxiety concern that I'm going to be stuck somewhere and not be able to recharge my electric vehicle quickly enough to be able to get me there. And some of that's technological. Some of that's we need to build the infrastructure as well, these charging stations to support it. But that's one underlying concern. Second is there's going to be a massive transition in the industry, right? We know that the internal combustion engine vehicle industry traditionally in the United States is a massive employer. There's just lots of jobs, final assembly, engines, transmissions. Estimates are there may be 30% fewer parts, right? So a lot fewer jobs. Those jobs are in politically sensitive areas of the country. And Gordon has done work on some of this to kind of show what the implications of the green transition is going to be for jobs. And so, we're still dealing with politically the legacy of the China shock here in the United States. We know there's going to be dislocation for workers transitioning out of the ICE industry as well. So think maybe another China shock sort of magnitude there. And then finally, when it comes to actually making these things, the critical inputs that go into them, so we're talking about the batteries especially, you've got critical minerals, and yes, some of them are mined in Africa, cobalt, but they're virtually all processed, at least, if not mined also in China. And so it's, 80-90% of these, whether it's the critical minerals, lithium, cobalt, nickel, those kinds of things, or the components, the anodes, the cathodes in the batteries, are flowing through China at some point. And China, on the export restriction side, has a tradition of liking to use market power when it has it and using export restrictions for commercial purposes. But we're also potentially heading into a new world with geopolitical conflicts where you might say, well, we don't want to be coming off of Russia, Ukraine, and what we've seen with the weaponization of energy supplies there. Maybe you're worried about national security vulnerabilities. So that's sort of where we were. And then basically almost a year ago at this time, we ended up with this surprise piece of legislation in the United States, the surprise announcement between Senator Joe Manchin of West Virginia, right? West Virginia, coal-producing state, and Chuck Schumer, the Senate Majority Leader. Surprise, there's this thing called the Inflation Reduction Act, which has nothing to do with inflation or reducing it, by the way, but it has a lot to do with climate, right? There's other stuff in there as well, but there's a lot of stuff in there in climate. I'm going to focus only on electric vehicles. And the thing to learn first is there's a special provision in there for consumer tax credits for electric vehicles called Section 30D. These are the ones that you or I would normally get access to. $7,500 if we buy an electric vehicle, and you wouldn't get that if you buy an ICE vehicle, right? So there we're kind of targeting the externality, trying to convince consumers to switch. Fine. There's also a price cap in there. So it can't be for super expensive models, trying to convince, the automaker, and an income cap. So I can't be too rich to access these kinds of things. There's a household or an individual income limit there. The idea broadly was to convince the automakers to really tackle climate. They need to produce attractive models for the masses, right? Enough of the high-end Teslas, enough of the Porsche fancy things. Buy stuff that average Americans would find attractive and buy to really build out, get us from 5% to whatever, 30, 40, et cetera. Okay, so that on its face, okay, consumer tax credits. But the United States turned this into an industrial policy by essentially saying, in order for you to receive, an American consumer to receive the tax credit, it only qualifies for vehicles assembled in North America. Now, it turns out this was actually better than the initial version of better, I'm not allowed to say that. It was, had a wider geography than the initial version of the legislation, which was the United States only. This includes Canada, Mexico, sort of recognizing the North American supply chain for automobiles. But it's very much a local content restriction and is sort of antithetical to the WTO's rules and the subsidies agreement about prohibited subsidies in these kinds of things. But the United States did it. Building onto that, even if the vehicle is assembled in North America, over the next couple of years, the batteries have to come from a restricted set of places. So they can either be recycled in North America, or the critical minerals, they essentially have to come out of, over the next couple of years, they can't be coming from China anymore if you want to get access to this tax credit. And they can either be from the United States or from a free trade agreement partner. Small f, small t, small a. We'll come back to that in a second. And similarly, for the components have to be from the United States only, right? So that's sort of, they're designing this industrial policy to achieve those objectives that I put up before. Local content is to kind of get at jobs. The sourcing for the battery is to kind of move the supply chain out of China because they're worried about national security. Okay. And this is just to kind of summarize all the criteria that have to be met. Right. So as we're studying, we've seen a number of papers on industrial policy over the last couple of years. It's really the details really matter about this stuff. And so here are the details. Okay. August of 2022. Not everybody's happy about this. Sorry? No, there was no check there. So yeah, I'm going to extend that chart or that table in a minute. Okay. First reaction, the South Korean government gets upset, right? And again, this is a country that's arguably protected militarily from the United States. So it's not obvious to understand why they would get upset. Denouncing the National Assembly, resolutions, they see betrayal, they threaten to fire economic advisors. Can you imagine the horror of such a thing? Now, this is also the second part of the headline was there was also apparently a theme park default. So maybe that was but anyway, you can see how serious this was. So this is the end of August. I'm on vacation and not paying all that much attention. I get back to my office in Washington and trying to figure out what's going on. Well, the betrayal story is essentially President Biden and his first state visit outside of Europe had been to South Korea, kind of a big achievement for the South Koreans. And one of the things that he had done when he was there was had a very public meeting with the CEO of Hyundai. And at that very public meeting and event, the Hyundai CEO announces that they're going to be doing more investments in the United States for electric vehicles, right? So imagine doing this announcement in Detroit or something, saying GM coming forward and saying, we're about to do $10 billion of investment in China. Yeah. But when the president of the United States is standing right there, it's kind of a big thing. So this is sort of all of a sudden this local content requirement meant that the vehicles that were being still assembled by South Korean firms in Korea would no longer have access to the US tax credit. And they were promising they would build electric vehicle facilities in the United States, but it's like semiconductors. It takes 3 or 4 or 5 years for these things to come online. It wasn't gonna be ready until 2025. They were hoping to have access to the old tax credits to kind of tide them over. And that was sort of what they were expecting. And so the Inflation Reduction Act caught them by surprise and they thought that this was betrayal, right? So what happens? South Korean trade minister meets with very important academic to complain about the Inflation Reduction Act. So this is true. That is the South Korean trade minister now. In real life, he also happens to be a law professor at Seoul National University and a personal friend, and we've been, worked on things together for years. But he's now currently the trade minister, but he literally did get in touch with me and said, Chad, I'm coming to Washington. I have to tell you about what's happening. So he shows up and he tells me about essentially people are rioting on the streets of Seoul about the Inflation Reduction Act, right? And the National Assembly has told him he's got to come and fix this. And I'm like, I just got back from vacation. What is this Inflation Reduction Act? What are you talking about? Anyway, so they're complaining and they're very serious. I wanted the second picture is the next day when the US trade representative, after a meeting, they're basically going to have now, he said, weekly meetings about this issue. But I want to make the point where he's wearing the same tie in both pictures. So that's the link between the two. Okay. So, but the US government doesn't really do much about it, right? It takes really the Europeans to start complaining, which they do over the course of the next couple of months for action to happen. So in the initial December, French President Macron shows up, baguette in hand. If you look at the photo closely, this is the Financial Times. It's not my picture. Complaining, and essentially in a joint statement during the state visit with President Biden says, "Oops, the law was not written very precisely. Some senator who was writing about it didn't even know that we didn't have a free trade agreement with our economic allies in NATO and Europe and probably South Korea too. So we'll do something about it." So what did they do about it? So they have to implement this law in terms of writing the actual regulations to make it work, to put it into practice, right? And so that's the Biden administration's job. They're in charge during this process. And so because it's part of the tax law, this is Treasury, right? And so Brent Neiman's not here, but I presume, right, Brent is now at Treasury. This is his job. No, I'm kidding, but there's lots of people at Treasury whose job it is, but he's part of the administration at this point. So one of the things that they do is they say, well, actually, if you look at the details of this law, all of those restrictions that Kala had pointed out, and there's something on business there, those are for that Section 30D thing. There's this completely other track of the Inflation Reduction Act called Section 45W. It's normally for commercial vehicles, so tractor trailers, delivery vans, things like that. We're going to consider a vehicle that you or I would get access to, so like a car, that could also qualify, as qualifying as a commercial vehicle if it were leased. Okay. Okay, it's creative. Now, why is that interesting and important? Because if you look at the X's, none of those controversial criteria about has to be assembled in North America, has to satisfy a price cap, can't be too expensive, only no high income people can buy it, the battery's got to be sourced out. None of that stuff applies for that other track, right? So that's the first thing they do. Second thing they do is they say, well, free trade agreement, it's not defined anywhere in the law. We'll define it ourselves, and that over the course of the next couple of months is what they've been doing. Okay, so the question is, okay, what is the impact on that so far? So if the Inflation Reduction Act had really bite, right, really had bite, we would expect it on August 16th, when this local content requirement went into effect immediately and made South Korea so mad and Europe so mad that imports from those places would have dropped off the map immediately, right? So does that happen when we actually look at the data? And the answer is no, right? So imports of electric vehicles into the United States from both, from the EU and from Korea, continue to grow. And you say, well, that's puzzling. Why? Well, arguably the December to January period is because there were no models eligible from anybody, right? So imports really weren't discriminated against when there were no models that were eligible. Part of that was in the old consumer tax credits, there was a cap of 250,000 units per maker. So Tesla had already used up their 250,000, and they didn't relax that cap until starting January 1st. The upshot was there were very few models eligible. Imports weren't discriminated against. But starting January 1st, effectively, there's this additional explanation, which is leasing, right? So the question is, did leasing change? So here's the benefit of actually being a podcast host. I'd read in the New York Times, this Edmunds company, a Kelley Blue Book, if you know anything about cars, there are these private companies out there that collect data on various things. And Edmunds had this leasing data. So I got in touch with them and said, I host a podcast. Do you have somebody there that can speak to your leasing data, please? And they put me in touch with the right person. And I had her come on the podcast and talk about it. And then I said, oh, and you know what else I'd like to do? I like to make charts. Can you actually send me that data? So she sent me the data, and this is basically what it looks like. And, it's kind of the amazing story. So this was, end of December of 2022. So right before the announcement goes into effect, fewer than 10% of new electric vehicles entering the US market were being leased. But by March, it was already over a third, right? So the car companies kind of figured it out very, very quickly. That this was an option for them to kind of work around the constraints. And then subsequently, I've learned that this data is actually in Bloomberg. So I've actually got access to it, and I can put it together now. So there's a diff and diff there, sort of. It's electric vehicles from Europe relative to ICE vehicles from Europe. There's some weird things happening in the leasing market because of the pandemic. We can talk about it if you want. So you can actually see the European electric vehicle kind of recovery happens before the announcement, but you can understand for the Koreans why they were so worried, right? 2% of Hyundai's electric vehicles were being leased prior to this announcement. They were like, this is not going to help us, but they figured it out pretty quickly, and now it's over 40% for them as well. Okay, so that's that. But again, there's no price cap, there's no income cap. You're not, if the goal was to national security concerns, incentivize the companies to move their supply chains out of China, this takes that away, right? So this sort of undermines some of the other goals that were in this industrial policy in the first place, which is just to say, maybe this isn't the end of the word on this, and maybe Congress revisits it at some point. And also the jobs and local assembly part is weakened as well. All right, lastly, on tariffs. Normally we think tariffs are trivial. Who cares about tariffs? Well, for electric vehicles, in terms of a differential discriminatory tariffs, they kind of matter. So remember, I showed you that China was a major exporter. They're not a major exporter into the US market. Why is that? Well, because the United States, it does have only a 2.5% MFN tariff, but the tariff facing cars coming in from China is now 27.5%, and that's because of the trade war, right? That was one of the first things the Trump administration put tariffs on. We weren't importing EVs from China at that point. In fact, it was just the opposite. We were exporting a lot of EVs to China at that point. But there's a really big tariff barrier to prevent that from coming in. Whereas the Europeans, a major complainer about the US policy here, they have a 10% tariff on EVs. They have massive discrimination in terms of offering preferences to other key competitors from the US side trying to export to the European market. South Korea already has 0 in effect. Japan is being reduced through their FTA, and we still face 10%. So this is the European imports of electric vehicles. We, the United States, used to export a lot of Teslas to Europe. Then what happened in the trade war, the Trump administration put tariffs on parts. China retaliated with tariffs on finished vehicles. Tesla said it's too, and that wasn't just Tesla, other car companies said it's too expensive for us to export from the United States to China. We're going to move production elsewhere. Tesla accelerated the production of their gigafactory in Shanghai. Now, essentially, if you're importing Teslas into Europe, you're buying them from not the US anymore, but China, right? So that's interesting, future of supply chains. France presses the EU to threaten trade war against China. Small print, but Paris is seen as pushing a probe that could result in Chinese electric vehicles facing tariffs, right? So anyway, old school trade policy may ultimately come into play when it comes to green energy products and electric vehicles, even in addition to industrial policy. So the future of global value chains, which is the question that I was told to answer, I have no idea.
All right, yeah, thank you very much for inviting me on this panel. It's great to be back here with my old friends, and gives me the opportunity to get something off my chest. So I'll take the liberty to speak a little bit more broadly about the future of globalization, but I promise I'll also say something about global value chains. But I have resisted the urge to call this presentation "Wake Up, My Friends, Your House is on Fire." But this is really the main message that I want to convey. So I make four simple points. And the first point is that we're really at a crucial moment in the history of globalization. So globalization is really in quite a substantial crisis. And you know, the way I think about the globalization crisis, I think about it in three different layers. So the first layer is I ask myself, well, what has happened to the narrative about trade, the narrative about globalization? And I really think this narrative has changed quite fundamentally. So it used to be, there was this vision that was guiding, you know, policymaking, trade policymaking around the world, that was kind of emphasizing that what we really need for peace and prosperity is we need economic interdependence. And this vision has, you know, as we heard also in the previous presentations, very quickly in the last few years, changed to kind of an alternative perspective, which suggests that what we really need is economic independence. And if it's economic interdependence, then please only among friends. So that's the first layer. I think the narrative has really changed quite fundamentally. The second layer is, you know, ask myself, well, what has this change in the narrative about globalization? What has it done to trade policy? What has it done to tariffs? And I think there are not just tariffs, you know, trade policy more generally. And I think there we also see quite some significant changes. And, you know, I think we're all aware of them. You know, the elephant in the room is, of course, the trade tensions between the United States and China. These, you know, tariffs, some of them at least have been in place for 5 years now. We think of it as if this was kind of the most normal thing in the world. I still remember when I presented my paper on trade wars and trade talks for the first time. And it's not that long ago, you know, people would say, oh, you know, this is a really interesting exercise in economic history, but we're not going to have trade wars again. And if we have trade wars, tariffs are never going to be that high. And, you know, now it doesn't even make headlines anymore that we have very high tariffs in place. But it's not just the tariffs, you know, we have the export restrictions that, you know, we heard about before. We have, I think, a revival of industrial policy, you know, sometimes with protectionist tendencies. So, you know, there's a lot of kind of change already happening in trade policy. And then the third layer of the globalization crisis is, well, what has this change in trade policy done to outcomes? You know, what has it done to trade flows? And, you know, for a long time, you know, at least we at the WTO argued that, you know, or kind of saw in the data, well, not that much. So we used to say, you know, there's all this talk about deglobalization, you know, but really you don't see it in the data. But Chad, you know, had the foresight and kind of saw where things were going. And, you know, really you do start to see signs of it in the data. And, you know, first you see signs of global value chains responding. So you see, you know, activity moving out of China into places like Vietnam, into places like Thailand, and into places like South Korea. But you also see things like if you look at the share of value added in gross production or in total trade, let me say this, rephrase this. So if you think about the share of intermediate goods trade and total trade, it's been pretty constant and at 50% for many years. But now if you look at it in the last few quarters, it's been coming down. So you really see kind of first signs, I think, of GVCs responding. And you also see first signs of geoeconomic fragmentation. So for example, and Chad has shown this to all of us, you see changes in the composition of Chinese imports into the United States, that kind of correspond to the tariffs that are in place, kind of as you would expect. You see changes in imports or in import shares, into the US moving out of China and into other countries and so on. And you also see, so one thing that we've done recently is we've kind of divided the world into two hypothetical blocks, an East and West, according to UN voting patterns. So don't take this too seriously, but just to get a sense. And what you're beginning to see is that intra-block trade is growing faster than inter-block trade. So you see some signs of geoeconomic fragmentation. And what this kind of all kind of combines to for me is that we're really at a crucial time in the history of globalization. We're really on our way, I would say, to change the course of globalization, but we haven't quite done it yet. So I think it's really an important time to act. Now, why is this all happening? My interpretation is it's not that people don't understand that there's economic gains from trade. I think more fundamentally, people think that trade is really part of the problem to the most pressing challenges of our time, or certainly not part of the solution. And what are the most pressing problems? I would say, well, first, it's to maintain peace and security. And with the security also means supply chain security, so resilience. It's to achieve a sustainable economy, and it's also to reduce poverty and inequality. And if you think about supply chains again, the whole experience of the pandemic, but then also the war in Ukraine now, people have kind of taken this as examples of how globalization exposes them to excessive risks because we had supply chain disruptions. And the conclusion, the conclusion that has been drawn from this is what we need is we need friendshoring, de-risking, home shoring, and so on. So that's the first point. The second point I want to make is that we're also at a crucial moment in the history of the World Trade Organization. And, as I just mentioned, we see this rise in protectionist tendencies. And that's, of course, not good news for an organization whose existence is about internalizing trade policy externalities. But I think there's an even more fundamental problem, and I think this more fundamental problem has something to do with the credibility of WTO rules. Because, as we know from, Nuno's work, for example, the credibility of rules is, of course, absolutely key, because if we have an increase in trade policy uncertainty, if, firms, households don't believe anymore that the tariffs that have been agreed upon are also going to stay in place, that alone, without any change in tariffs, is going to have very important effects on trade volumes. And it is my sense that governments are increasingly driven by other policy priorities, particularly the ones I mentioned before, to maintain peace and economic security, to achieve a sustainable economy, to reduce poverty and inequality. You can think about jobs, for example, as we heard before. And sometimes I would say perhaps pursue these policies without much regard for the rules of the WTO. And what this means is that the rules-based trading system, I think, is at risk of becoming the collateral damage of shifting policy priorities. Because at the end of the day, if people get the impression that countries are not playing by the rules, then of course this raises trade policy uncertainty. Now, the third point I want to make is that this kind of matters. So a lot is at stake, for two reasons. And the first reason is that trade is actually part of the solution. And I think this audience, I probably don't have to do too much to convince of this. But if you think about global value chains again, I think it's pretty clear, and I think we all know this, that trade, in fact, not only has been very resilient itself, if you look at the past crises, but has also been a huge source of resilience during the past crises. I mean, if you think about the pandemic, there I think it's most obvious. Of course, initially there's been some supply chain disruptions, but then very quickly, we all needed to work from home. What did we, why could we do this? Because we could, order the consumer durables and get them, shipped to us. We could get the personal protective equipment from China when, we were in lockdown, but they weren't anymore. We got vaccines that were, ultimately that were produced in global value chains, crossing, multiple countries and so on. So I think it's pretty clear that contrary to kind of conventional wisdom, trade really was an important part of the solution. And now saying, we don't want to trade anymore, I think would be a big problem. And I can talk about this for hours, but I don't think I need to convince you it's the same for achieving a sustainable economy. It's the same for reducing poverty and inequality. I don't think we'll be able to achieve these objectives without embracing international trade. So that's why trade is important. But I also think the WTO is still very important. And this is, perhaps something I need to spend a little bit more time on convincing you of. Because there's kind of this sense out there that the WTO doesn't matter anymore, that the WTO is kind of irrelevant, it's not working, it's not making any progress. And in some sense, if we don't play by the rules, who cares? And, I think this is something where I have to say I've really learned a lot over the last 6 months being at the WTO. And the first point is that, the WTO still continues to be the cornerstone of global trade. So one interesting statistic, despite all the trade tensions, despite all the extraordinary tariffs, 75% of world trade is still conducted under MFN tariffs of the WTO, 75%. Yeah, so the vast majority of international trade is still conducted under WTO rules. And second, so this speaks for, or this calls for us, I think, not reversing what is already in place at the WTO. But then there's also the sense that there's no progress at the WTO, and that's also just not true. I mean, first of all, if you look at the multilateral negotiations, we concluded a trade facilitation agreement just last year, an agreement curbing subsidies to fishing, so fisheries subsidies. And yes, it's maybe not the great achievement that we all hoped for during the Doha round, but I think these are very significant achievements in multilateral trade negotiations. But then the other thing, I used to, when you go to kind of policy discussions, people always say, well, what does the WTO need? The WTO really needs more plurilateral negotiations, so more negotiations that don't involve all members, because getting 164 countries to agree is really difficult. Well, now I come to the WTO and I see that's happening. Yeah, it's not something, I mean, it's good that people call for it, but it's already ongoing. A plurilateral agreement was concluded on services domestic regulation. That's basically trade facilitation for services. Just last week, a large number of members agreed on a text on investment facilitation for development. Again, something like trade facilitation, but for investment. There's a plurilateral negotiations ongoing for e-commerce. For example. So there's lots of stuff happening. It's not that, sometimes people say the WTO is nothing but a building in Geneva. But I can tell you it's not true. There's a lot of things going on, and I think a lot of progress being made. And then also, if you just look at the day-to-day work, I mean, this is maybe not the most exciting stuff, but, there's the TBT committee, for example, where countries, have to notify regulations that they put in place, product standards that are put in place. Other countries can voice trade concerns, can say, this is problematic for us. And in these committees, I think a lot of potential conflicts get diffused. So a lot of it is at stake, because I think what, we are about to tackle, or what we are perhaps about to lose, I think is really important. Which leads me to what I wanted to get off my chest, which is where are we, and where are you? As academics, because really what I want to kind of drive home is the point that there's really a kind of historic crisis unfolding in our field of study. And I would like us and you also to feel kind of some urgency, I think, to think about that crisis and kind of participate in preventing it, perhaps, or kind of solving it, perhaps, to some extent. And I think there's a great opportunity in a way, because one thing that, somewhat to my surprise, I will confess, I've learned at the WTO, is that research really does matter. So policymakers, do read these studies, they do read papers. When we put out a report, they want to hear it, they discuss it, they take it seriously. So I do think if we put out kind of relevant studies, I think that really has the potential to have an impact on policy discussions. So that's the opportunity, but I think there's also a bit of a risk for our profession here, because if there's kind of a globalization crisis ongoing, and the firefighters, if you will, don't pay attention, I think that's also not great. It's a little bit like the macroeconomists not having seen the global financial crisis, or not understanding why inflation is so high, or something like this. And this sounds a little bit negative, and of course I'm trying to be a little bit provocative here. I mean, I know that many people do very important work, and in fact kind of ruined it a little bit by putting some very relevant papers on the program today already, and throughout this conference. So I don't want to say that there's no kind of work ongoing, of course, that speaks to this crisis, but I cannot help but feel that the sense of urgency that I feel in Geneva is quite different than the sense of urgency that I feel here. It's not that, and I would just like to encourage you, and also encourage us to kind of pay attention to this crisis that is unfolding, and perhaps do something about it. Thanks.